All right, today is October 29, 2017. So today, I think today many Protestants, especially Lutherans and Calvinists, will be celebrating today what will happen Tuesday, which is what? What are Lutherans and Calvinists celebrating this coming Tuesday, October 31st?
Halloween.
It's not Halloween. It happens to fall on Halloween. It starts with an R. Reformation, what do they call it? Day. I've heard Reformation Sunday.
Yeah.
So 500 years ago, a guy called Martin Luther nailed the infamous 95 Theses. By the way, this is allegedly. A lot of historians don't even think he did actually nail it. But so 500 years ago he did that, and that started the whole Reformation. So yeah, it's a very interesting day because it falls on Halloween, and I say how apt, how what was the word I used? How ironic, whatever you want to call it. The Reformation did some good things, but I always say that a lie has a grain of truth. A lie has some truth in order for it to be a lie, but it's still a lie. Now, why do I say that? Well, I not only say it, but there's a good article online. I don't know if I put it. Next slide, huh? No? I guess not. Anyway, go back to the main. There's a good article called "It Was Not Luther." Maybe Michelle upstairs can quickly Google it. It was not Luther who was the champion of liberty, but Erasmus. Now, who was Erasmus?
What do you want to know?
Erasmus? Anyone? Go once. Erasmus, Desiderius Erasmus, was a Dutch Catholic monk in the early 1500s who is very much touted. He's a favorite of humanists. Now, what's a humanist, you might ask? Well, humanists are generally against religion, against organized religion. Like Anthony says, we are disorganized religion. People always say, but are you guys organized religion? Anthony says, no, we're disorganized. I hate organized religion. That's why I'm coming to you guys. I guess we're disorganized. So it was not Luther who was the champion, but Erasmus. His name's Brian McClinton. He's from the Irish Freethinker newsletter. I think it's a letter or a newsletter. And yeah, maybe you can look that up. He wrote a very interesting article a couple of days ago. In part, he says, the true test of a commitment to liberty and freedom of speech is not in the struggle to remove tyranny, but whether you grant that freedom to your opponents when you have the power to do so. Both Luther and Calvin failed this test by showing themselves to be as illiberal, not too liberal, and intolerant, no patience, as the priests and popes whom they criticize. I don't know if you know, but Calvin is known as the Pope of Geneva by many. So that's an interesting article. You can look it up. It's not just my opinion. Many people have criticisms against Martin Luther and Jean Calvin. So that's what people are celebrating. But today, I am not so much celebrating. We are observing a very awful thing that happened almost a week before October 31st. And this happened on October 27th. And that's the burning of this man. Michael Servetus, also known as Michael Servetus. So I'd like to do a quick little in memoriam, in memory of this man who is really the father, the grandfather, really of the what we call Socinians, Polish Brethren, and now Biblical Unitarians. So I'd like to tell you a little bit about this man, who he was. That's a monument. This monument, by the way, is interesting. Are you getting thanks to Misha for holding the phone or thinking the devil doesn't like you. That's for sure. He hates you. Sorry, just saying because we had technical problem. Monument in Annemasse, France. There's an interesting story behind this monument. It's in France. When the Nazis rolled into France, they destroyed a lot of bronze statues and metal statues because they needed it for war. So they burned these things down, they melted them to use it for bullets and all kinds of stuff. This is the original monument, but it was burnt down. But later, decades later, after the liberation and so on, they recreated the monument to their credit. A bunch of humanists, I love humanists, they got together and put it back together. All right, come in next. So who was Miguel Servetus? He was born in a small village, really, to a noted Spanish lawyer. His mother was Jewish, they just found out a couple of years ago. The town is called Villanueva de Sigena, Aragon, Spain. He was sent to Catholic monastery. He was a very, they tell me your daughter is very intellectual, very, very smart. This guy was very smart. He was sent to Catholic monastery early on, so he grew up Catholic. He was later sent to France to study law. His father was a notary, which today translates as a lawyer. It's said that by his teens, he was fluent in Latin, Greek, Hebrew, and he wrote his first book, really, on the errors of the Trinity by his early 20s. I believe he was 21 or 22. What were you doing when you were 20? I know what I was doing. I wasn't writing books.
I went to Russia.
You went to Russia. I wasn't doing any of that stuff. I was a bad kid. Other books, Dialogues on the Trinity, On the Justice of Christ's Reign, and his last work, The Restoration of Christianity. That last book, they burned him with all the known copies of that book. I'll tell you more about that. Catholic persecution from those books, you can appreciate, drove him underground. So he spent the rest, really, of his adult life, about 20 plus years, because he was killed when he was 44. I'm 44. Anyway, never mind. He was killed, so he spent the rest of his life underground because the Catholics were after him. So he goes to France. He worked as a cartographer, which is a map maker, and a physician. His discovery of the pulmonary circulation would later gain him fame among humanitarians. At the time, he reached out to some of the reformers. He actually wrote letters to Luther with his anti-Trinitarian Anabaptist ideas. And a Baptist is a person who doesn't believe in babies being water baptized, by the way, and started a decade-long correspondence with one of the reformers, Calvin. At first friendly, their conversations turned rather bad. Calvin would actually later use hundreds of letters these guys exchanged through a decade at least. Calvin would later use those as evidence against him in court in Geneva. Next, you got your handouts there, I believe. Can Anya read the first quote, please?
Servants has just sent me a long volume of his ravings. Servetus has just sent me a long volume of his ravings. If I consent, he will come here, but I will not give my word, for if he comes here, if my authority is worth anything, I will never permit him to depart alive.
Right. And what's amazing to me is that all this is written down in his own hand, and Calvinists defend this guy. It's incredible. Unfortunately, while in hiding in France, he's discovered by a friend of Calvin, by the way. He's uncovered, as it were, and he tries to flee to Italy because he hears about a guy called Socinus, or Socinus. He was an Italian Unitarian, former Catholic himself, but because of him, the movement became known as Socinians. And, sorry? You can interrupt anytime, anyone, if you want to have questions. Anyway, so he tries to go to Italy, but he's arrested by the Catholics on his way there. He managed to escape from the Catholics and headed to Geneva, thinking that Calvin would and other reformers would welcome him, if not with open arms, at least it'll be a haven for him. But guess what? He's immediately recognized, arrested, and again imprisoned by the Genevans. The Genevan authorities, who are, at this point are semi-secular. Switzerland, at that point, was in a struggle between so-called liberals and Protestants like Calvin. There was a power struggle there. So Calvin was not totally in power yet, but it was sort of a mixture. After more than 2 months, he was imprisoned in a dungeon. Really, if you watch those medieval movies, that's what this guy suffered for almost 3 months. Malnutrition, lice, awful conditions. His wealth, his money were taken from him. And after almost 3 months, he was sentenced to death by burning for denying, and they were specific, for denying the Trinity and infant baptism. Yes. Sarah, can you read the next quote there, please? This is from Beacons of the Light, a book by Braybrook.
To prolong his agony, new wood was used that took longer to burn. His last words were, "Jesus, Son of the eternal God, have mercy on me." Calvin ordered to hunt for and destroy any remaining copies. But in fact, in what is an amazing story in itself, 3 copies survived, including Calvin's annotated personal copy in his library.
There's a gentleman, Stephen Blake, was it? Out in California, a fellow Unitarian who's in the movie industry. He's a producer now, and he's hoping to get this story someday in some kind of format in English. But the story is incredible. Just this story, the reason I use this quote, just the story about the survival of these books is amazing. And one of them was in Calvin's own personal library. And it was annotated, which means he read it. He studied it. He put his own notes in it. I mean, the mind. Immediately, so he's killed, he's burned alive, 1553. Immediately there are some dissenting voices. One of them was an incredible man who, actually I should do a sort of little expose on. Sebastian Castellio was his name, a French Catholic who became a Protestant himself. And he had this to say, Barbara, that quote please.
If it's not blind rage to torture in the flames a man who is calling on the name of Christ, and not only is not convicted, but is not even accused of any crime, then there's no such thing as blind rage. To kill a man is not to protect a doctrine, but it is to kill a man. To protect a doctrine is not the magistrate's affair. What has the sword to do with doctrine? But the teacher's. To seek truth and utter what one believes to be true can never be a crime. No one must be forced to accept a conviction. Conviction is free.
This is your bumper sticker. Actually, I'm going to make that into a bumper. Zazzle.com, by the way. No one must be forced to accept a conviction. Conviction is free. Beautiful. So this guy was an incredible man. He didn't agree, by the way, with anti-Trinitarian ideas. He didn't. He was still a Trinitarian, but he was a liberal-minded, like Erasmus. By the way, Erasmus, I mentioned him earlier, did not agree with the Trinity insofar as a salvation issue. there's actually letters from Erasmus that we have. By the way, Erasmus is the guy who because of him, we know that 1 John 5:7 is a corruption. There are three in heaven, Father, Son, Holy Spirit, and these three are one. Because of him, this guy died a Catholic, Erasmus. Again, I can do a whole expose on Erasmus, an incredible human being. So these people were courageous. We talk about courage nowadays with this horrible situation from Hollywood, all the corruption there, but really, courage is when you stand up at the time of the event. Not 10 years later, not 5 years later, but when you're standing alone, usually, we're standing alone here, our little church, our little group, but we're standing really against a machine, a system that kills us every day, by the way. This hasn't stopped, because Jesus says if you have hate in your heart, you're a murderer. A system out there hates you every single day, and they murder us every single day. So this hasn't stopped, folks. What has stopped is the actual burning of us, thank God. So Anya and Misha is proud. They're young kids here, and I'm glad to have you here to hear this, and hopefully this can impact you as it did me. But you might be saying to yourself, not only the young people, but peoples of old days, so what's this got to do with me? Well, agree or disagree with this man, Servetus, and what he taught, and agree or disagree on this country of the United States of America. There are many critics of this country, but there are many supporters. And I mean a supporter insofar as what happened later. Because these ideas by Erasmus, Servetus, and then Castellio formed the foundations of this nation. That's why we're able to do what we're doing right now. So obviously I thank God for that, and I'm a great supporter of that. Vicky, can you read that next quote, please?
Sure. Each person should maintain whatever religious faith he wishes, with old or new rituals, while we at the same time leave it to their judgment to do as they please in the matter of faith, just so long as they bring no harm to bear on anyone at all.
This was written only 7 years after Servetus, in 1559, by the Queen of Transylvania in the first edict of religious tolerance. This was the first time in history, incredible, that a head of state said, you know what, let's not kill each other over religion. What an idea, right? 1559, and it was the Transylvanians, Dracula themselves, who came up with this. And then a couple of years later, a formal edict came out called the Edict of Torda, by the way, Torda, if you want to look that up. So again, what's this has to do with us?
They didn't all follow that.
Sorry?
She came up with that edict, but you still had Catholics torturing Protestants torturing Catholics. In the New World, even when they came to America in the 1600s and 1700s, there was still much persecution over just what a person believed.
Right. Thanks, Michelle. That's exactly right. Yeah, but the point that this was made legislation doesn't mean that it actually happened, because as Michelle points out, actually, Michelle, you remind me, Protestants go on in the 16th and 17th century to preach in countries like India and Japan by force. And then, of course, the Inquisition is still going on. 1600s through to the 1700s, especially killing Jews, which is amazing. So what happens? So what's the other great legacy of Servetus? This country. The next quote there. Who hasn't read that? Michelle, did you?
I
No?
don't have the paper.
Barbara, can you finish up? This is from a great paper I recommend, From the Polish Socinians to the American Constitution, by our good humanitarian friend, Marianne Hillar, who's a professor, a doctor of Socinian Studies, and I have his, I'll show you his website. Please support this man, because he supports us. Someone showed me recently a letter he wrote supporting one of our pastors, saying, I'm not a believer, but I want to support you on this. Yeah, that's a, thanks, Misha. Sorry, I'm almost done, buddy.
It's just small. The words are small.
Oh, that's all right. Thank you. So this is a paper he wrote almost a decade ago now, I think. A must read. It's not too long. Barbara, just read a little bit of that, please.
The ideas of John Locke were transplanted directly to the American continent by James Madison and Thomas Jefferson, who implemented them for the first time in American legislation. They were philosopher-statesmen who shared a strong conviction of absolute freedom of conscience and distrusted any kind of established ecclesiastical institution. Their conviction was that the established churches create only ignorance and corruption and introduce the diabolical principle of persecution. Do you want me to continue?
Yeah.
The exercise of religion should be completely separated from government. Toleration was not enough. Only absolute freedom could be acceptable. For them, democracy was the best guarantee of religious freedom. It was an institution that erected a wall of separation between church and state and protected the liberties of minority groups against the imposition of majority views. Both were broadly educated, and Jefferson had a keen interest in studying religions, especially Servetus and the Socinians.
Most Americans don't know this, but at least 5 of the presidents of this country were not just Unitarians. They rejected the Trinity, God in three, but they were Socinian in principle. They were principled Socinians. You got the Madisons, you got the Adamses, you got, of course, Jefferson, you got Taft, and I think that might be it. But to go back to Michelle's point about, the lady from Transylvania, the Queen, wrote that down, but this was the key. See, this is the key. Toleration was not enough. Only absolute freedom. Now, although, as some of you might know, that we are against war, we are against the military-industrial complex and so on, we should love our enemies and so on, which is not always easy. But nonetheless, a lot of bloodshed, a lot of people have died to keep this going, to keep the absolute freedom of thought and religion in countries like this. So we do, obviously, we have to honor the king, and we have to honor the authorities, of course. That's Romans 13. So we obviously are thankful for those people who do that on our behalf. So with that, Anthony, I'll just close with prayer, and
Yes, why don't you?
we don't.
No song.
Yep.
Right.
So, yes, thanks for you can actually just end
Actually,
it.
why don't you just do a little Zoom show
No.
out the people?
Yeah. Okay.
Just turn around.
Well, I don't know if people want to be shown. No, maybe not. Just end it here, and yeah. All right. So we'll pray, and we'll pray for the food, and you got it.